My interest in creepy things started at a very young age. I credit this in part to the children's programming of the 90s and early 2000s, which, whether intentionally or not, often scared the absolute bejesus out of me. And from what I've read online, I'm not alone in this.
Return the slab, or suffer my curse.
Yeah, how many of you remember this guy? If online forums for the last 10 years are to be believed, I'm guessing it's a lot of you. I know childhood trauma videos are popular, but to be honest, I wouldn't even really call these traumas. Well, most of them. Rather, these are the scares that, while making me want to sleep with the lights on, I still kept coming back to. In no particular order, this is my personal tank of childhood nightmare fuel. The Library from the Pagemaster. This is a series of images that is forever burned into my subconscious. It felt like some rusty old gears in the deepest part of my brain started turning again when I watched this scene over 20 years after I last saw it. After getting caught in a surprisingly sudden and intense storm on the way to the store, Macaulay Culkin's character takes shelter in a seemingly deserted old library. Though it appears to be closed, he soon finds it to be occupied by the old librarian, played by Vladimir Lenin, played by Christopher Lloyd, who tries to get him to take out a book in the most unnecessarily threatening manner imaginable. The librarian sends him into the library in search of the public phone so that he can call his parents. As he makes his way to the back, we find that this library is a huge maze of towering bookshelves, and the rotunda contains artwork of various literary figures, who stare down at him ominously. He slips on the wet floor and loses consciousness, and when he comes to, there's something truly terrifying about having to run from a rushing, seemingly sentient wave in this massive cavernous space. It's not helped by the brain-shattering blend of live-action, traditional animation, and early 90s CGI, which makes for an incredibly unnatural-looking effect. It all feels like something you'd see in a dream, and for that reason, it definitely left an impression. The scary movie from There's a Nightmare in My Closet. There's a Nightmare in My Closet was one of the books I learned to read with. It was probably my first favorite book, so imagine my joy when I realized there was actually a movie made. It's what you'd expect. This kid is afraid of a monster that no one else believes is living in his closet. He makes preparations to confront it, and then realizes it's not so bad. Standard kid stuff. But that's not the part that scared me. Early on, the kid starts watching an old horror movie about this couple who enter what appears to be an old abandoned house on a dark and stormy night. The house is cluttered with furniture, all eerily covered with sheets. The woman briefly sits on one of them, and when she gets up,
All right, Philip, let's have a look. Well, then don't.
You can let your imagination run wild with this one. Is there a person under that sheet? How did she not notice? And what do they look like underneath? How long were they just waiting there in the dark? Or could it be that it's not a sheet at all? Is this what ghosts look like? And if so, are these all ghosts? Only some of them? Which ones? Imagining a dark house, lit only by the occasional lightning strike, while white forms of various shapes wander silently about, really freaked me out as a kid. The Kitchen from Tower of Terror. I really liked this movie back in the day, and looking back now, it really holds up as a prime example of 90s cheese. But the set design is nice, I guess. Truth be told, I think I just liked looking at it more than anything. I never did find it all that scary, except for this one scene. During a photo shoot at the abandoned hotel, The characters are interrupted when they hear what seems to be faint piano music coming from somewhere inside the building. Steve Guttenberg's character leaves the others to investigate and winds up in the kitchen. As he makes his way through, the music seems to grow in volume, echoing off the walls of the large, dark room. Soon, he begins to hear other things as well. Sounds of activity, unintelligible conversations, glass and silverware clanking. And as he rounds a particular corner, it all just stops. The room now filled with an uncomfortable silence that's somehow worse than the ghostly ambiance. Of course, the movie now has the nerve to hit us with. On its own, this would have been a pretty standout scene from what is otherwise a pretty unsubtle cheese fest. But it's not over yet. Though the tension is momentarily dissipated, they're soon on the trail of a new sound. The faint trickling of water. And singing? And when they get to the other side of the kitchen,
I think I want to be someplace else.
this otherworldly effect, combined with the distant singing, makes for a surprisingly spooky scene coming from a movie that only minutes ago gave us this. Oh, and then it ends with some more unsubtle 90s cheese, but I still like this scene. The intro from Are You Afraid of the Dark? In the previous video, I went over the infamous Dead Man's Float episode, and spoke briefly about how this show's use of genuine scares, without an over-reliance on diluting those scares with comedy, often made it the scarier alternative to Goosebumps. What I didn't mention was just how creepy this show's intro was, with shots of a boat left on the shore with its occupants nowhere in sight, a dark, deserted playground with a swing blowing in the wind, banging shutters, and an attic inhabited by an unsettling doll with a malicious grin on its face, all accompanied by a forlorn soundtrack and ominous sounds culminating in a ghostly chorus. In its short runtime of not even 30 seconds, this intro perfectly sets the mood for some scary stories that the show itself arguably doesn't live up to. Yeah, I actually find this intro to be scarier than the show it's attached to. A show that was infamous for traumatizing a generation at that. Under Chuckie's Bed. If I remembered more of this show, I'm sure I could come up with a million examples for the list. Its weird animation and soundtrack make it oddly uncomfortable to watch in hindsight, but I'm focusing on this episode in particular because it actually managed to scare me as a teenager. I used to like this show when I was like 4. I was up late one night in high school and saw that it was on Netflix, so I decided to watch an episode more or less at random for the nostalgia value. It was your standard fare for the show. Chuckie gets a new bed to replace his crib, and is convinced there's a monster hiding underneath. As with every episode, we get this experience from a baby's perspective, with exaggerated proportions to represent the anxiety of missing the walls of the crib. He finally reasons that there's nothing to be afraid of. And then...
There's nothing living under my bed.
Chucky.
This show would often show us mundane things as the babies would see them, and even while watching, I did remember a scare from later in the episode where he seemingly finds the monster itself, only for it to later turn out to be a sweater. Things like that happened all the time. What I did not expect was a deep, booming voice to suddenly pierce the silence out of nowhere. It caught me even more off guard because I had seen this episode before. but I guess as a preschooler I somehow didn't find it scary enough for it to leave an impression. In my jump scares video, I talked about how startling moments can land better if it's something you didn't even know could happen. And let me tell you, I did not expect something like this from Rugrats. What scared Sue Ellen? Like Hey Arnold, Arthur was a show that could be surprisingly spooky when it wanted to be. Unlike Hey Arnold, though, Arthur falls more into the edutainment genre. Since it's using spooks as a premise to deliver lessons for kids, it does end up being more tame by comparison, but I'd argue that this also puts it in a unique position to achieve a certain feel that other shows can't. My favorite such episode was What Scared Sue Ellen. The episode opens with Arthur, Buster, and Binky telling each other scary stories in the treehouse. Sue Ellen is unimpressed and generally being a huge Redditor about it. But as she begins her walk home through the woods, she finds herself unusually nervous, jumping at every noise and gust of wind. As her paranoia builds, her mind runs wild on what creature of folklore might be stalking her, such as a kappa, a banshee, or her chief suspect, the Baba Yaga, a Russian witch who lives in a house that walks on chicken legs. This is where the edutainment aspect comes in. It's pretty cool learning about these lesser-known myths that American kids might not otherwise know about. Unlike other entries in this list, there's no real standout scares in this episode, apart from one actual jump scare in the form of a false awakening dream. Rather, what I like about this episode is the feeling it's able to convey. Everything on the screen, from the colors to the environments, to even the clothes they're wearing, just screams autumn. As I've talked about before, creepy and comfy tend to travel together, and this is a great example of that concept in action. Mainly, though, I appreciate it for its expression of daylight paranoia. If you want to make something scary, you set it at night. That's like the rule. But this episode isn't really about scary things. It's about being scared, and the nervousness that carries over into this character's days. I used to know a story I'd read was good when I was still anxious the next day at school, in broad daylight and surrounded by people. I don't know if I've ever seen that feeling portrayed more accurately than it was right here. So that was just some of my childhood nightmare fuel. If you want more, you can check out my previous video on the subject at the link in the description. I'm only drawing from my own experience here, so I'm really curious to know. What were some things that scared you as a kid? Let me know in the comments, and as always, thanks for watching.